Hey, here we are back from spring break. I hope you had a great spring break, and I hope everybody's healthy and well, and everybody around them is also doing okay. So we are back, and this week we're going to be talking about ideology and cultural criticism. So we're playing off of chapter six, the second part of the chapter six in the textbook. It's called cultural criticism. Before the break, we tackled rhetorical criticism, which has a long history. And this week, we're looking into later cultural criticism that comes out of British cultural studies in England, and they were very influenced by ideas about ideology from Karl Marx. So Marx, as you know, is the poster child of communism and of Marxist theory, I guess, class theory. I'm not going to delve deeply into that, although I would if we had a class together. I want to get right into some ideas that people working much later than Marx in the 1970s in England came up with the discipline of cultural studies, which looked at all kinds of stuff in popular culture, but they were very influential, and thus a lot of their ideas made their way into television criticism, which was up and coming around the same time. Some key concepts that we're going to be dealing with are culture and ideology. And so I'm just sharing my screen with you, checking into cultural criticism. Obviously, we'll be looking at a little bit of The Handmaid's Tale, but other examples as well. And you saw I clicked on lecture. This gets you to the slides that I used to present this stuff in class. So today we're going to be talking about the encoding and decoding model from Stuart Hall, who was perhaps the major figure in cultural studies, and then also looking at some other concepts. So let's jump right in. I'm going to be playing off what we see in the slides today. To kind of structure the lecture. I think it'll keep things shorter than the last one, which I felt was too long. Here we go, looking at the encoding and decoding model of cultural studies. So first of all, what does cultural studies consider culture to be? So here's the definition. As you see, it's in yellow. That means it might appear as a question on an exam at some time. Culture, the actual practices and customs, languages, beliefs, forms of representation, and a system of formal and informal rules that tell people how to behave most of the time and enable people to make sense of their world through a certain amount of shared meanings. So we've covered that last definition of culture, even as we looked closely at television representations, visual style, and narrative. You know, whenever we were talking about conventions and how people draw on shared knowledge in order to understand what they're seeing in a television show, we're using that second sense of culture here, how people make sense of their world. So that's the idea that we all draw on this shared body of knowledge, which could be considered culture. In this week's presentation and in next week, the emphasis of culture falls more on the idea of representation and the rules that tell people how to behave. So this brings in sort of the notion that culture gives us guidelines, or in fact even rules that we've got to follow. So that brings in this idea of power, that which enables one person or group to exert his or her will and interest over others. And so this is a group of television critics and cultural theorists who think that the most important thing about culture is how it coerces or guides us into particular understandings of the world. And this is why they connected with Marx's idea of ideology, because Karl Marx thought that although economics was perhaps the most important form of domination that one experiences in a society, that there was something he called ideology, which was the set of ideas or meanings which made us think that the economic domination that we lived under was the good thing, the right thing. And so that's Marx's notion of ideology is sort of ideas in the service of power. So Marx was, of course, working in the 1870s. 100 years later, cultural theorists like Stuart Hall drew on Marx for a lot of ideas and understandings of how ideology can make us into the kinds of receptive people that will believe in what we're fed by the culture. So I'm going to jump right into Stuart Hall's, one of his theoretical formulations, which some people call reception theory. And this is the idea that when we are watching television, our social position, in other words, our class, our gender, and certain other characteristics about us, our education, incline us or predispose us towards three different ways of interpreting what we're watching. He called these readings. So in other words, depending on what category we're in or what demographic categories we're in, we're likely to see a television show in three different ways. Could be what he called the dominant reading, which is what the culture typically would like us to believe as we watch. There's the oppositional reading, which is a complete rejection of the dominant reading. So imagine if you're an activist who's watching a sort of a very police positive procedural, you might look at it and say, this is BS. These police are not these super nice people. They are, on the contrary, something quite the opposite. That would be an oppositional reading. And then there's what Hall called a negotiated reading, where you have to kind of work somewhere between the two, negotiate some kind of personal meaning out of the two. So enough said on that. Let's take a look at our media theorist. He's going to present us a video on this.